The metal felt like ice against the skin. It wasn't just a gun. It was a sudden, violent end to everything 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling knew about the world. 1 second, he was pedaling his bike through the crisp Minnesota air, the plastic reflectors on his pedals flickering in the dark. The next, a man stepped out of the shadows of a rural driveway, and the universe collapsed into the black circle of a revolver's barrel. Jacob didn't have time to scream. He didn't have time to think about the hockey game he wanted to play or the homework waiting on his desk. He only felt the vibration of his own heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird trying to escape a cage. The man stood there, towering, his face hidden behind a rough nylon mask that distorted his features into something inhuman. His eyes were wide, fixed, and devoid of anything resembling mercy. The gravel beneath their feet shifted with a harsh, grinding sound that seemed deafening in the stillness of the St. Joseph night. This wasn't a movie. There was no heroic music. There was only the smell of damp earth, the biting October wind, and the terrifying realization that the tall, armed stranger wasn't going away. Jacob's younger brother, Trevor, and his best friend, Aaron, stood frozen, their bikes wobbling as they gripped the handlebars so hard their knuckles turned white. The air felt heavy, thick with a sudden, agonizing fear that choked the breath right out of their lungs. The stranger didn't just want their bikes. He wanted them. He wanted the innocence of a small town that had never known a reason to lock its doors. Before we dive into this shocking and heartbreaking story, subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The stranger's voice didn't sound like a man's. It sounded like a jagged stone dragging across a rusted floor. "Throw your bikes in the ditch," he barked. It wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the weight of a loaded weapon. Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron moved like wooden dolls, their movements jerky and fueled by a primitive instinct to survive. The bikes, the very things that represented their freedom just moments ago, clattered into the tall, dry grass. The metallic sound of the frames hitting the earth was the final bell toll for their childhood. "Now get on the ground, face down." The cold, damp dirt pressed against their cheeks. The smell of decaying autumn leaves and wet gravel filled their nostrils. For 11-year-old Jacob, lying there on the edge of a road he had traveled 1,000 times, the familiar world had become a hostile, alien landscape. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of the man's boots as he paced behind them. Every footstep was a heartbeat. Every second of silence was a jagged blade of suspense. The man didn't just stand over them. He loomed like a predator evaluating his kill. The fear in that moment wasn't just about the gun. It was the crushing weight of unfairness. These were children who had done everything right. They had stayed together. They were nearly home. Yet here they were, being forced into the mud by a coward with a mask. The anger boils in your chest when you realize that this man looked at 3 innocent boys and saw nothing but an opportunity to inflict pain. He didn't see human beings, he saw targets. As he walked behind them, checking their faces, the boys could hear his labored breathing, a wet, disgusting sound that would stay locked in their memories for decades. This wasn't a person. It was a void that had stepped out of the darkness to swallow their lives whole. Suddenly the packing stopped. The man stood behind Trevor and Aaron. "You too," he growled, his voice thick with a terrifying urgency. Run into the woods. If you look back, I'll shoot you." Imagine the poison of that choice. Trevor, only 10 years old, had to leave his brother. Aaron had to leave his friend. They scrambled to their feet, their legs feeling like lead, their lungs burning with a cold fire. They sprinted toward the trees, the branches clawing at their clothes like skeletal fingers. Every fiber of their being screamed at them to turn around, to fight, to yell, to do something. But the threat of a bullet in the back kept their eyes locked forward. But Jacob was still on the ground. He was the one the man had chosen. As the other 2 boys vanished into the brush, the silence that fell over that gravel road was heavier than any mountain. Jacob was alone with the monster. He was 11 years old, a boy who loved hockey and his family, now forced to face a nightmare without anyone to hold his hand. The betrayal of that moment is enough to make your blood run cold. Two boys running for their lives, and one boy left in the dirt, wondering why he was the one the shadow didn't let go. It is a level of psychological torture that no child should ever endure, a wound that began to bleed in 1989 and wouldn't stop for 27 years. When Trevor and Aaron finally stopped running, when they finally dared to look back over their shoulders, the road was empty. The man was gone. The bikes were still in the ditch, their wheels spinning slowly in the wind. But Jacob had simply evaporated. There were no tire tracks screaming away, no sounds of a struggle, just the vast, indifferent Minnesota night. The rural road, which usually felt like a safe path home, now looked like a crime scene waiting to happen. The air was still crisp, the stars were still bright, but the world had broken. The vacancy where Jacob had been was a physical ache, a hole in the atmosphere that felt like it was sucking the oxygen out of the town of St. Joseph. The boys didn't know it yet, but that empty space on the gravel road was about to become a national obsession. It was the beginning of a void that would consume investigators, haunt a mother's every waking hour, and change the laws of an entire country. The Shadow Man had taken more than a boy. He had taken the security of every parent in America. He had proven that evil doesn't need a reason, it just needs a moment of darkness. As the two boys ran the final stretch toward the Wetterling home, their hearts nearly bursting with a story that felt too heavy for human tongues, the clock on a 27-year nightmare began to tick. The front door of the Wetterling home didn't just open, it exploded inward. Trevor and Aaron burst through the frame, their lungs whistling with the effort of a mile-long sprint fueled by pure, unadulterated terror. They weren't crying yet. They were beyond tears, caught in that jagged space where the brain refuses to accept what the eyes have just witnessed. Inside, the house smelled like a normal Sunday night, warmth, laundry, the lingering scent of a family meal. But as the boys stood gasping in the entryway, their clothes torn by briars and their faces pale as ghosts, that domestic peace died instantly. Think about your own front door. Think about the safety it represents. You lock it at night to keep the world out, never imagining that the world has already reached out and snatched a piece of your heart from the driveway. This is the moment where every parent's reality fractures. You look at your child, safe and breathing, and then you look at the empty space beside them where their brother should be. The transition from a quiet evening to a national tragedy happens in the time it takes to draw a single, panicked breath. It is a theft of peace so total that it leaves you paralyzed. Trevor tried to speak, but the words were caught in a throat constricted by fear. He wasn't just a 10-year-old boy anymore. He was a survivor of a violent encounter, carrying a message that would break his mother's soul. He had to tell them that Jacob was gone. He had to say the words out loud, knowing that once they left his lips, they could never be taken back. The silence of the house was replaced by the frantic, rhythmic thudding of a family's heartbeats, all racing toward a realization that was too heavy to carry. Patty and Jerry Wetterling looked at their son and saw a stranger's terror reflected in his eyes. At first, the mind tries to build a bridge back to sanity. You tell yourself it's a prank. You tell yourself he's hiding in the ditch, playing a joke that has gone too far. You reach for any excuse, any lie, just to avoid looking into the mouth of the abyss. But the trembling in Trevor's hands was real. The way Aaron couldn't stop staring at the dark window was real. The boys described a man with a gun and a mask, a figure that didn't belong in the rolling hills of St. Joseph. The anger begins here, in the cold realization that a predator had been watching. This wasn't a random accident. It was a calculated strike against the most vulnerable. While the Wetterlings were inside, thinking about school schedules and hockey practice, a man was standing in the weeds of a gravel road with a revolver, waiting for the sound of bicycle tires. The violation of that thought is a physical blow to the chest. It turns your home from a sanctuary into a cage. You realize that the boundaries you thought protected your family were nothing more than illusions drawn in the dirt. As the boys recounted the stranger's raspy demands and the terrifying moment they were told to run, the gravity of the situation began to crush the room. There was no more room for denial. Every second that passed without Jacob walking through that door was a second where the monster was getting further away. The pain of those first few minutes is a sharp, jagged thing, a frantic need to do something, anything, mixed with the horrifying knowledge that you have no idea where to start. The world had just become a much larger, much darker place. The phone receiver felt like it weighed 100 pounds when Jerry finally dialed the Stearns County Sheriff's Department. The voice on the other end was professional, clinical, and detached, a stark contrast to the raw, bleeding panic in the Wetterling living room. "My son has been taken," is a sentence no father should ever have to utter. It is a confession of helplessness that tears at the very fabric of what it means to be a protector. The dispatcher asked for descriptions, for heights, for clothing colors, as if Jacob could be reduced to a set of data points on a flickering computer screen. While the police began to mobilize, the family was left in a state of agonizing suspension. The house felt too small to contain the grief and too large to feel safe. Every shadow in the corner of the room looked like a man in a mask. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a footstep. You start to play the what-if game, a mental torture that never ends. What if they had stayed home? What if they had taken a different road? The guilt starts to settle in, a heavy, suffocating blanket that tells you that you failed, even though the only failure belonged to the man in the woods. The hunt was beginning, but it was a hunt for a ghost. The stranger had vanished into the labyrinth of rural roads and cornfields, leaving behind nothing but two traumatized boys and a family whose life had just been sliced into before and after. The urgency of the 911 call was met with the cold reality of 1989 technology. No GPS, no cell towers, just a radio dispatch going out into the night, hopping that someone somewhere saw a car that didn't belong. The solution was miles away, hidden in the dark, while the problem sat right there in the middle of their living room floor. Within minutes, the quiet gravel road was swarmed by deputies, their flashlights cutting through the autumn darkness like frantic needles of light. They found the bikes, the red one, the blue one, discarded in the tall grass like toys in a graveyard. The sight of those bikes, still warm from the boy's grip, was a visceral reminder of how quickly a life can be uprooted. The police checked the woods, the ditches, and the outbuildings of nearby farms, their voices calling out Jacob's name into a wind that didn't answer back. The fear in the community began to spread like a virus. Neighbors woke up to the sound of sirens and saw the strobing blue and red lights reflecting off their bedroom walls. The news traveled from house to house. A boy was gone. Not an accident, not a runaway, but taken. It changed the way people looked at the woods. It changed the way they looked at each other. If it could happen to the Wetterlings, a good family, a safe family, it could happen to anyone. The realization was a cold shiver that traveled down the spine of every parent in Minnesota. He never saw the danger coming, and most people don't. Subscribe so you're not caught off guard by the shadows in your own town. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment. What's holding you back from standing with us against the dark? By dawn, hundreds of volunteers would be standing in those same fields, but for now, there was only the sound of heavy boots on gravel and the hollow, terrifying silence of a road where a boy had simply ceased to exist. The first hour was over, and the clock on a 3-decade nightmare had officially started to tick. The transformation of St. Joseph didn't happen with a roar. It happened with the metallic click of thousands of deadbolts sliding into place at the exact same time. Before that October night, a key was something you kept in a drawer or under a mat, a formality for a world that felt fundamentally kind. But by Monday morning, the hardware stores were stripped bare. People stood in line with trembling hands, buying up every padlock, every bolt, and every motion sensor light they could find. They weren't just buying metal and glass. They were trying to purchase a sense of safety that had been stolen from them in a single hour on a gravel road. The air in town changed. It became heavy with a new kind of suspicion that made neighbors look at each other through narrowed eyes. Every white van was a threat. Every man walking alone was a monster in waiting. You could feel the anger vibrating in the grocery store aisles, a silent, burning rage that someone had the audacity to bring such filth into their sanctuary. The open-door policy of the American heartland died that week. Parents who used to wave from their porches now stood like sentries at their windows, watching the street with a frantic, desperate intensity. The tragedy wasn't just that Jacob was gone. It was that the certainty of the world had been proven a lie. You think you know your town. You think you know the people who live 3 houses down. But when a boy vanishes into the thin air of a familiar neighborhood, you realize you don't know anything at all. The collective psyche of St. Joseph fractured, replaced by a cold, hard shell of self-preservation. They were no longer a community of neighbors. They were a community of survivors, huddled behind locked doors, waiting for a knock that they now feared would actually come. Dinner time in central Minnesota used to be a cacophony of clinking forks and stories about school, but in the weeks following the abduction, the silence at the table was suffocating. In every house within a 50-mile radius, parents sat across from their children and found themselves unable to swallow. They looked at their own sons and daughters and saw Jacob's face. They saw the vulnerability of a small frame, the thinness of a child's wrist, and the terrifying ease with which a life could be snuffed out. The injustice of it felt like a physical weight on the chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from watching your child lose their innocence in real time. You see them stop asking to go outside. You see them check the locks themselves before they go to bed. You see the light in their eyes dim as they realize the world isn't a playground, but a hunting ground. The anger of the fathers in St. Joseph was a quiet, dangerous thing, a desire to tear the world apart to find the man who had done this. But there was no one to fight. There was only the empty chair at the Wetterling table, a void that seemed to grow larger and darker with every sunset. Every time a parent hugged their child a little too tight, they were acknowledging a truth they weren't ready to face, that they were helpless. No amount of love, no amount of caution, and no amount of prayer had saved Jacob that night. The realization was a poison that seeped into the soil of the town. People stopped talking about the future and started obsessing over the past, over every detail of that night, searching for a mistake they could learn from. But there were no mistakes. There was only a predator who had chosen a moment, and a town that was now paying the price in blood and tears. The very landscape of the region began to shift to accommodate the new reality of fear. The gravel road where it happened wasn't just a road anymore. It was a scar on the earth. People avoided it. They drove miles out of their way to stay clear of the spot where the bikes had been found. It was as if the ground itself was cursed, holding onto the echoes of the boy's screams and the smell of the stranger's mask. The woods that used to be a place for fort building and adventure became a wall of terror, a place where anything could be hiding, watching, and waiting for a moment of weakness. This was the birth of a new era of parenting, one defined by the constant, nagging presence of a what-if. The freedom of a bike ride was replaced by a leash of anxiety. The stranger danger drills in schools became more than just lessons. They became a way of life. The architecture of the town changed as fences went up and bushes were trimmed back to eliminate hiding spots. St. Joseph was being rebuilt as a fortress, but no matter how high the walls were. The ghost of Jacob Wetterling was already inside, a constant reminder that the enemy didn't need an invitation. The trauma became a character in the town's story, a silent inhabitant that lived in every basement and every attic. You could see it in the way people walked, faster, with their heads down, eyes scanning the perimeter. The joy of the changing seasons was replaced by the dread of the early darkness. October was no longer about pumpkins and hayrides. It was about the anniversary of the night the lights went out. The town had lost its soul because it had lost its trust. And without trust, a community is just a collection of people waiting for the next tragedy to strike. As the months turned into years, Jacob's story evolved into something even more haunting, a legend used to keep children in line. He became the boy who never came home, a cautionary tale whispered by tired parents to children who didn't understand why they couldn't stay out past dusk. The Shadow Man became the boogeyman of central Minnesota, a figure that was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This was the ultimate victory of the predator. He hadn't just taken one boy. He had taken the peace of mind of an entire generation. The collective guilt of the town was a heavy, invisible fog. People wondered if they had seen the car. They wondered if they had heard a noise they ignored. They looked at the men in their own lives, the cousins, the coworkers, the quiet guys at the bar, and wondered if one of them was the monster. It is a devastating way to live, always waiting for the other shoe to drop, always looking for a crack in the facade of normalcy. The pain didn't dull with time. It just sharpened into a fine point of resentment against a justice system that seemed unable to find a single lead. But even in the middle of the paranoia, a small, stubborn flame of hope remained. It was a painful hope, the kind that keeps you awake at night wondering if today is the day the phone finally rings. The town of St. Joseph carried Jacob's memory like a lead weight, but they refused to drop it. They were a community bonded by a shared scar, waiting for a resolution that felt further away with every passing year. The story wasn't over. It was just sinking into the bones of the earth, waiting for a day when the truth would finally be forced out of the shadows. In the early months after that October night, the silence in the Wetterling house was loud enough to scream. Patty Wetterling could have stayed in that silence. She could have let the grief pull her under, retreating into the shadows of a life that had been violently uprooted. Most of us would understand that choice. We know the weight of a loss so heavy it threatens to crush the ribs. But as the weeks bled into months with no sign of Jacob, Patty realized that her grief was being met with a systemic failure. The world wasn't set up to find her son, and it certainly wasn't set up to stop the next man waiting in the grass. She made a choice that was as much about survival as it was about justice. She decided that if the world was broken, she would be the one to hammer it back into a shape that protected children. This was the moment a mother became a warrior. She looked at the posters of her smiling boy and saw not just a victim, but a reason to demand change. We often think of heroes as people with capes, but the real ones are the parents who find the strength to stand up when their legs are shaking with fatigue and sorrow. She refused to let Jacob's name be a footnote in a police file. She was going to make it a rallying cry for an entire nation. The anger she felt wasn't a wild, uncontrolled flame. It was a cold, focused heat. It was the energy she used to answer the phone, to talk to the press, and to keep the search alive when the rest of the world started to look away. She understood that if she stopped speaking, the monster won. Every time she stepped in front of a microphone, she was reclaiming a bit of the ground that had been lost on that gravel road. She was building a bridge between her family's private hell and the safety of every playground in America. When Patty Wetterling arrived in Washington, D.C., she didn't look like a political powerhouse. She looked like what she was, a mother who hadn't slept through the night in years. But when she stood before Congress, her voice carried a frequency that cut through the usual political noise. She didn't speak in statistics or legal jargon. She spoke in the language of a parent who knows the exact layout of a child's empty bedroom. She told them about the hockey sticks leaned against the wall and the birthday parties that would never happen. She forced the most powerful people in the country to look at the reality of a stolen life. The grit it takes to turn your most vulnerable moments into public testimony is something few can comprehend. We see the bravery, but we don't see the cost. Every time she told Jacob's story, she had to go back to that road. She had to feel the cold October wind again. She had to remember the exact moment the light went out. Yet, she did it over and over because she knew that silence was the predator's greatest ally. She became the voice for every child who had ever been taken, and every parent who was still waiting for a phone call that never came. She wasn't just asking for help. She was demanding a revolution in how we track the people who hunt our children. She stood in those marble halls and reminded the world that our current systems were a joke. There were no registries. There were no ways to know if a predator had moved in next door. She made them see that the lack of information was a weapon in the hands of the wicked. By the time she was finished speaking, the room was different. She had taken her personal wound and turned it into a mirror, forcing the nation to see its own failure to protect its most precious resource. In 1994, the effort of years of advocacy finally culminated in the signing of the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act. It was a massive victory, a landmark piece of legislation that changed the legal landscape of the United States forever. For the first time, states were required to maintain registries of those who had committed crimes against children. It pulled the names of predators out of the dark and put them on a list that law enforcement could actually use. It was a shield forged in the fire of a mother's determination, a way to ensure that no predator could simply vanish into a new town and start over. This law was the first of its kind, the foundation upon which all modern safety systems were built. It changed how we think about community safety and how we hold the dangerous accountable. But even as the pens moved across the paper in the Oval Office, the irony was thick enough to choke on. The law bore Jacob's name, yet Jacob was nowhere to be found. The act was a success, but for the Wetterling family, the mission was only half finished. They had changed the world, but they hadn't changed their own reality. The registry could track 1,000 men, but it hadn't yet tracked the one who mattered most to them. The value of this legislation cannot be overstated. Millions of children are safer today because Patty Wetterling refused to be quiet. We live in a world where we can check a map and know who is living in our neighborhoods, and we owe that to a boy who vanished in 1989. But laws are made of paper, and the man who took Jacob was made of flesh and blood and secrets. The tension of the unsolved case remained a jagged edge, cutting through the celebration of the legal victory. The victory was for everyone else's children. For Patty, the search was still a daily, grinding battle against a wall of silence. There is a profound, echoing loneliness in being the face of a national movement while your own heart is still out in the cold. Patty Wetterling spent her days helping other families find their missing kids, offering them the hope that she was struggling to maintain for herself. She would sit in meetings, discuss policy, and lobby for funding, and then she would go home to a house where one chair remained empty. It is a level of emotional labor that would have broken a lesser person. The price of her advocacy was that she could never truly move on. She was tethered to 1989, frozen in the moment of her son's disappearance. The gaping wound of the mystery didn't heal. It just became a part of her anatomy. No law, no matter how strong, could fill the space Jacob left behind. Every time a new missing child case hit the headlines, she felt the phantom pain all over again. She was the one the world looked to for strength, but who was she supposed to look to? The anger at the man who took him was still there, a constant hum in the background of every speech and every interview. It was an injustice that grew more bitter with every passing year, that the truth remained hidden. We see a woman who changed the laws of a nation, but we must also see the mother who just wanted to know where her boy was buried. The legislative legacy is her gift to us, but the mystery was a burden she carried alone. As the years stretched into decades, people started to talk about Jacob in the past tense, but Patty never did. To her, he was still the boy in the red jacket, still the 11-year-old who loved hockey. The story had become a cornerstone of American law, but the core of the story, the truth of that night, was still buried in the dirt of a Minnesota field, waiting for a breakthrough that seemed like it might never come. 9 months before the world ever heard the name Jacob Wetterling, the darkness had already made a trial run in the town of Cold Spring, just a short drive away. It was a freezing January night in 1989 when 12-year-old George Shale was walking home, unaware that a predator was stalking the frozen streets. The attack was a carbon copy of the horror that would later unfold on that gravel road in St. Joseph. A car pulled up, a man stepped out, and suddenly a weapon was drawn. The man wore a mask that distorted his humanity, and he spoke with that same terrifying, raspy growl that suggested a throat filled with gravel and malice. He didn't just want to scare Jard, he wanted to dominate him. The predator forced Jard into the vehicle and drove him to a secluded area, where he committed a brutal assault that left the young boy physically and emotionally shattered. The details of that night are a grueling reminder that this monster didn't appear out of thin air in October. He was practicing. He was refining his methods. He was learning how to snatch a child in broad daylight or under the cover of a winter moon without leaving a trace. The anger you feel when looking back at this moment is almost unbearable. This boy survived. He gave the police a description. He told them about the car, the voice, and the weapon. The blueprint for Jacob's abduction was already in a police file months before it ever happened. But in the early weeks of 1989, the world felt smaller and more disconnected. Cold Spring felt like a lifetime away from St. Joseph, even though they shared the same air and the same fear. The man who attacked Jard was a ghost who had found a way to slip through the cracks of a sleepy county. He was a resident of the area, a man who knew the backroads and the hiding spots, and he was already hunting. The tragedy of Jard's assault is that it should have been the end of the story. It should have been the warning that saved a life. Instead, it became a haunting prologue to a much larger nightmare. When the man finally let Jard go, he left behind more than just a traumatized child. He left behind biological evidence on Jard's clothing, a physical mark of his presence that he couldn't take back. In 1989, the science of DNA was like a foreign language that no one quite knew how to speak yet. The investigators in Cold Spring did their job. They collected the evidence, they put the clothing in a bag, and they locked it away in a dark room. They had the very code of the monster's identity sitting on a shelf, but they didn't have the tools to read it. It was a key without a lock, a piece of a puzzle that wouldn't make sense for another 3 decades. Jard carried the weight of that night alone for a long time. He had to live with the memory of the mask and the feeling of the cold steel against his skin, all while watching the news cycle explode with the disappearance of Jacob Wetterling later that year. He saw the similarities. He felt the connection in his bones. He knew that the man who had hurt him was likely the same man who had taken Jacob, but his voice was just one among thousands of tips flooding the phone lines. The evidence remained stagnant, a silent witness gathering dust in an evidence locker while the predator continued to walk the streets of Minnesota, breathing the same air as the families he had destroyed. This is the ultimate mystery box of the case. The solution wasn't hidden in some far-off state or buried in an untraceable grave. The solution was in a plastic bag in a police station. The delay in justice wasn't due to a lack of evidence, but a lack of technology. It is a devastating thought to realize that, for 27 years, Jard lived with the trauma and the Wetterlings lived with the hole in their hearts, all while the monster's own cells were sitting in a climate-controlled room, waiting for the world to catch up. The frustration of this missed connection is a fire that burns through the history of this investigation. Why didn't the police link these two crimes immediately? In the wake of Jacob's disappearance, the sheer volume of information was overwhelming. Tips were coming in from all over the country. Psychics were calling with visions, and every suspicious neighbor in the Midwest was being reported. In that sea of noise, the case of a boy who survived an assault in Cold Spring didn't get the priority it deserved. Law enforcement agencies were fragmented. The sheriff's office and the local police departments weren't always sharing their files with the fluidity we see today. There was no central database where a detective could type in "masked man with raspy voice" and see a list of similar hits. The anger at this bureaucratic wall is justified. If the two cases had been treated as the work of a single serial predator from day one, the search area would have narrowed significantly. They would have looked harder at the small town of Painesville, which sat right in the middle of both crime scenes. They would have looked closer at the men who lived there and had a history of troubling behavior. Instead, the investigations drifted apart. Jacob's case became a national symbol, while Jared's case remained a local assault file. The man responsible was allowed to retreat into his ordinary life, protected by the very chaos he had created. This failure of connection is a lesson in the high cost of investigative silos. We see a system that was built to react to individual crimes, but was wholly unprepared for a calculated, predatory pattern. Every year that went by without the files being merged was a year that the monster was allowed to feel safe. He watched the news, he saw the search parties, and he knew that as long as the police were looking for a stranger from out of town, they would never look at him. The ghost of the Cold Spring attack haunted the Jacob Wetterling case, a missed opportunity that would take nearly 30 years to finally rectify. The common thread between the two boys wasn't just the mask or the gun, it was the town of Painesville. This small community sat at the heart of the geography of these crimes. It was the home base for a man who knew exactly where the dead ends were and which roads were never patrolled. When you look at a map of where Jared was taken and where Jacob vanished, the lines all lead back to this one location. There was a shadow hanging over Painesville, a man who lived an unremarkable life while carrying secrets that would eventually shock the world. He was questioned, yes, but he was never the primary focus. He was just another face in a town full of faces. The investigators had his name. They had even looked at his car. But without the forensic link to Jared's assault, they didn't have enough to hold him. He was a man who knew how to speak to the police just enough to seem cooperative without giving anything away. He relied on the fact that he looked like everyone else. He was a chilling reminder that the people we should fear the most aren't the ones who look like monsters. They are the ones who look like our neighbors. The man in the shadow of Painesville was a patient predator, and he was counting on the world to keep making excuses for why the evidence didn't fit. The tension was building, even if no one knew it yet. The key to the mystery box was still sitting in that locker, but the clock was finally beginning to move forward. The forensic breakthrough was coming, a moment when the science of the future would finally confront the crimes of the past. The ghost of Cold Spring was about to speak, and when it did, the truth would be more horrifying than anyone in St. Joseph ever expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would bridge 3 decades of silence and finally bring a name to the man who had stolen the peace of a nation. In 2015, the air in the Stearns County evidence room felt heavy with the weight of 26 years of failure. For decades, the file on Jacob Wetterling had sat like a monument to an unsolved tragedy, a collection of papers and photographs that grew more yellowed with every passing season. But a new generation of investigators was stepping into the light. Men and women who hadn't been on the force when the bikes were found in the ditch. They didn't carry the same exhaustion as the people who had chased 10,000 dead ends. They brought with them a cold, analytical perspective and a piece of technology that was science fiction in 1989. They weren't looking for a miracle. They were looking for a molecule. One detective reached for the box labeled with Jared Sherrill's name. It was the case from Cold Spring, the one that had always lived in the shadow of the Wetterling disappearance. Inside that box was a piece of clothing that had been preserved with a level of care that bordered on the prophetic. It had been sitting in the dark, untouched, holding onto a secret that the original investigators couldn't see. The detective wasn't just looking at old fabric. He was looking at a time capsule. He knew that the answers weren't going to be found by knocking on doors or re-interviewing witnesses whose memories had faded into gray. The answers were locked in the fibers of that shirt. The shift in tone was sudden. The stagnant grief that had defined the case for a quarter of a century was replaced by a sharp, clinical focus. There was no more room for theories or guesses. It was time for the lab to speak. As the box was pulled from the shelf, the dust of decades was brushed away, revealing a path that had been there all along. The investigation was no longer about a missing boy. It was about a biological footprint that the predator had been forced to leave behind. The hunt was no longer cold. It was about to become the most intense pursuit in the history of the state. The clothing was sent to a modern forensic lab where the machines can find a single grain of truth in a mountain of static. In 1989, blood types were the best a scientist could offer, a vague grouping that could narrow down a suspect list but never point a finger at a specific man. But by 2015, the world had mastered the art of reading the human code. The technicians worked in a sterile environment, a world of white light and precision instruments that stood in total contrast to the muddy, dark road where the crime had occurred. They were looking for a ghost, a trace of skin, or a drop of fluid that the monster had long since forgotten. The process was slow and agonizingly precise. They had to extract a profile from a sample that was nearly 30 years old, fighting against the natural decay of time. It was a high-stakes gamble. If the sample had been contaminated or if the fabric had broken down too far, the trail would end right there in the lab. But the evidence had held. A profile emerged, a string of markers that represented a single, unique human being. This wasn't just a lead, it was a signature. For the first time in the history of the investigation, the police had a digital representation of the man who had worn the nylon mask. This genetic profile was the ghost of the man who had haunted the woods of central Minnesota. It didn't have a name yet, but it had a shape. It was a biological lock that was waiting for the right key. The lab technicians weren't just doing science. They were performing an exorcism, pulling the truth out of the past and into the present. The tension in the department was a physical thing as they waited for the results. They had the killer's identity in a computer file. Now they just had to find the man who matched the data. The gap between 1989 and 2015 was finally closing, and the predator had nowhere left to run. The moment the computer screen flashed with a match, the air in the room seemed to vanish. The profile pulled from Jared's clothing wasn't a mystery anymore. It was linked to a man named Danny Heinrich. But here is where the story takes a turn that will make your blood boil. This wasn't a stranger who had moved to another country. This was a man who had lived in the area the entire time. He was a man the police had actually spoken to in the weeks after Jacob went missing. He had been a blip on the radar, a person of interest who was discarded because there was no physical evidence to hold him. The realization hit the investigators like a hammer. They had been right all along. The monster hadn't been a ghost. He had been a neighbor. Now you have to ask yourself a hard question. Does a match on a 26-year-old shirt prove that this man also took Jacob Wetterling? Tell me in the comments. Is this biological proof enough to haul a man out of his bed and charge him with a lifetime of evil, or is it just a coincidence from a different crime? The debate in the legal offices was fierce. They had the DNA for the assault in Cold Spring, but they still didn't have a body for the boy from St. Joseph. The match changed everything because it gave the police a target they could legally pursue. They didn't have to wait for a confession. They had a scientific fact. But the anger of the community was already starting to simmer. If the DNA was there in 2015, it had been there in 1989. The only difference was our ability to see it. The investigators looked at the name, Danny Heinrich, and realized they were looking at the man who had stolen 30 years of peace from a mother's heart. The hunt was no longer about a pattern. It was about a specific house, a specific car, and a specific monster who thought he had gotten away with it. With a name in hand, the police began the process of closing the circle around Danny Heinrich. They didn't move with sirens and flashing lights. They moved with the quiet, deadly precision of a predator that had finally found its prey. They began digging into his life, looking at where he had lived in 1989 and where he was living now. The geography was devastating. He had always been right in the center of the crimes. He lived in Annandale now, a quiet man who kept to himself, a man who worked unremarkable jobs and avoided making waves. He was the definition of ordinary, and that was the most terrifying part. The tension was rising toward a breaking point. The authorities knew that if they moved too fast, he might destroy any evidence he still had. If they moved too slow, he might realize the net was closing and disappear. They were watching him, a man who had spent 26 years thinking he was smarter than the world. They saw him go to the store, They saw him drive his car, and they knew that under that unremarkable exterior was the raspy voice and the cold eyes from the gravel road. The circle was narrowing, and the shadow of Painesville was finally being pulled into the light of a search warrant. The investigation had shifted from a cold case to an active, high-pressure operation. Every detective involved felt the weight of Jacob Wetterling on their shoulders. They weren't just looking for a criminal, they were looking for a boy. They knew that Heinrich held the answer to the question that had haunted Minnesota for 9,855 days. The DNA breakthrough had given them the man, but the man was still holding onto the location of the body. The final confrontation was coming, a collision between the clinical power of modern science and the raw, unrepentant evil of a man who had lived a lie for a generation. When the name Danny Heinrich finally surfaced, people expected to see a face that reflected the horror of his crimes. They expected sharp features, a cruel mouth, or perhaps a look of obvious madness. But the man in the photographs was devastatingly common. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair, glasses, and a build that suggested a life spent behind a desk or a steering wheel. He looked like the man who would fix your shoes, or the person who sat 2 rows behind you at a local high school basketball game. This is the ultimate betrayal of our instincts. We want to believe that evil is recognizable, that it carries a mark we can avoid. Instead, we are forced to realize that the most dangerous people in the world often look like they couldn't hurt a fly. The shock comes from the realization that there was no outward sign of the rot inside him. He didn't have a criminal record that set off alarms. He didn't have a reputation for violence in his workplace. He was just a man who existed in the background of the town's daily life. This unremarkable quality was his greatest weapon. It allowed him to blend into the scenery of central Minnesota, becoming just another face in the crowd at the local fair or the grocery store. While the world was searching for a monster, they were looking right past a man who looked exactly like their own uncle or neighbor. It is a chilling reminder that the person you pass every day on the sidewalk could be carrying a secret that would freeze your blood. For 26 years, Danny Heinrich didn't flee to a remote island or hide in a bunker. He stayed right there. He lived in Painesville and Annandale, towns that were within a short drive of the gravel road where he had changed history. He worked various jobs, including a long stint at a local shoe store and time as a laborer. He paid his taxes, he kept his lawn trimmed, and he lived a life of quiet, solitary routine. The audacity of his presence is staggering. While Patty Wetterling was testifying before Congress and the town was holding candlelight vigils, Heinrich was likely watching the same local news reports from his living room. He didn't just hide from the community, he lived inside it. He was there when the schools changed their safety protocols. He was there when the stranger danger posters went up in every window. He watched the town of St. Joseph transform into a fortress of paranoia, knowing all the while that the source of that paranoia was him. He lived in the middle of the pain he created, feeding off the silence and the mystery for decades. This wasn't a man on the run. This was a man who had successfully integrated into the very society he had victimized. The anger this provokes is visceral. He wasn't just a predator. He was a parasite who thrived in the shadow of the very grief he had inflicted on an entire state. Heinrich's personal life was defined by a specific kind of isolation. He was a deeply solitary man who spent much of his free time engaged in technical hobbies that allowed him to watch the world without being a part of it. He was a licensed ham radio operator, a hobby that requires a high level of patience and a fascination with signals traveling through the dark. Some investigators later wondered if this technical skill gave him a window into the world of local law enforcement, allowing him to monitor scanners and stay one step ahead of the people searching for him. He was a man who understood how to listen, how to wait, and how to stay invisible while being perfectly audible. His other habits were equally unremarkable on the surface, but took on a dark hue once the truth emerged. He was known to spend hours driving the rural backroads of central Minnesota, familiarizing himself with every dead end, every hidden pasture, and every unlit driveway. To a casual observer, he was just a man who liked to drive. In reality, he was a predator mapping out his hunting grounds. He knew which roads were patrolled and which ones were forgotten by the sheriff's department. He used his hobbies as a cover for a lifestyle of surveillance. He wasn't just a man with a radio and a car. He was a man who had turned his entire life into a reconnaissance mission against the innocent. The most frustrating part of the entire investigation is how close the authorities came to stopping him just months after Jacob disappeared. In early 1990, Heinrich was actually questioned by the police. He lived in Painesville, and he owned a car that matched the descriptions provided by witnesses of a suspicious vehicle in the area. The investigators sat across from him. They looked into his eyes. They even took his shoes and tires to see if they matched the prints found at the crime scene. But in an era before advanced forensics, they couldn't find a definitive link. He was calm, he was cooperative in a distant way, and he didn't give them a reason to keep him. They let him walk out of the room. The man who had Jacob's blood on his hands was allowed to stand up, walk to his car, and drive back to his life. It is a moment of staggering injustice that haunts the history of the case. If the technology of 2015 had existed in 1990, the nightmare would have ended then. Instead, he was given another 26 years of freedom. He left that police station knowing he had beaten the system. He knew that if he could survive that level of scrutiny, he could survive anything. This close encounter didn't make him run. It made him feel invincible. He returned to his shoe store and his radio, confident that he had outplayed the law. The psychological horror of Danny Heinrich lies in the dual life he managed to maintain for nearly 3 decades. Every morning, he looked in the mirror and saw the face of a man who had committed unspeakable acts, yet he was able to walk out his door and function as a normal member of society. He didn't crack under the pressure of the national headlines. He didn't confess to a priest or a friend. He kept the secret locked in a vault behind his unremarkable eyes, watching as the years turned into decades. He was a man who had mastered the art of compartmentalization, separating the monster from the neighbor with terrifying efficiency. He stayed in the area because he wanted to be near the scene of the crime. He wanted to see the impact of his work. The fact that he never moved away is a testament to his arrogance and his predatory nature. He was a shadow that refused to leave the room. When the truth finally came out, the surprise wasn't that a monster existed. It was that the monster was so incredibly ordinary. He was a chilling reminder that the mirror doesn't always reflect the soul. He was the man next door, the man at the radio, the man with the quiet job, and he was the man who had stolen the light from 1,000 Minnesota nights. The morning the world finally came for Danny Heinrich, the sun rose over Annandale just like any other day. It was a quiet, unassuming neighborhood where the sound of a lawnmower or a barking dog was usually the only disruption. But the tactical vehicles that rolled down the street weren't there for a routine check. The FBI and the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension moved with a silent, lethal purpose that signaled the end of a 26-year game of hide-and-seek. There were no sirens, no shouting, just the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on a porch and the sudden, violent breach of a front door that had stood as a barrier between a monster and the light of day for far too long. As the agents flooded the house, the atmosphere was thick with the electricity of a long-awaited reckoning. They weren't just searching a residence. They were invading the private sanctuary of a man who had outsmarted the system for a generation. The tension was a physical pressure in the air. Every room they entered was a potential crime scene. Every closet they opened was a possible grave of secrets. They found Heinrich there, a man stripped of his unremarkable facade, standing in the middle of a life built on lies. The ordinary man from the shoe store was suddenly surrounded by the full weight of federal authority, and the look in his eyes wasn't one of surprise, but of a long-simmering realization that the clock had finally run out. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, confused by the sight of black jackets and high-powered rifles in their peaceful cul-de-sac. They didn't know that the man who lived among them was the answer to the state's oldest and most painful mystery. The raid was a surgical strike against the darkness. Every drawer pulled, every floorboard checked, and every computer seized was a step toward a truth that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. The air in the house felt stale, as if the walls themselves were tired of holding onto the things they had seen. The reckoning had arrived, and it was cold, clinical, and absolute. Inside the house, the investigators found exactly what they feared. It wasn't just a home, it was a warehouse of depravity. As the tech specialists began to crack open Heinrich's digital world, the screens filled with images that made even the most hardened agents turn away in disgust. They discovered a massive, organized cache of child pornography, thousands of files that documented a lifelong obsession with the exploitation of the innocent. It was a digital dungeon, a place where he had retreated for years to feed the hunger that had led him to that gravel road in 1989. The sheer volume of the material was staggering, a mountain of evidence that proved he wasn't just a one-time offender. This discovery provided the legal leverage the FBI needed, but it also deepened the horror. Every image was a reminder of another victim, another life touched by the kind of evil that Heinrich represented. The investigators worked in a grim silence, the clicking of keyboards the only sound as they documented the scale of his collection. But even as the evidence piled up, the primary question remained unanswered. They had the pornography, and they had the DNA match from the Cold Spring assault, but they still didn't have Jacob. The house was full of filth, but it wasn't giving up the location of the boy in the red hockey jacket. The mystery box was open, but the bottom was still out of sight. Having the man in handcuffs was a victory, but it felt hollow without the resolution the Wetterling family deserved. The digital evidence was enough to put him away for a long time, but it wasn't a confession for murder. The investigators felt the ticking of the clock in their own pulses. They knew that Heinrich was a man who thrived on control, and right now, he was holding onto the most important piece of information in the state of Minnesota. The search of the house continued for hours, a desperate hunt for a map, a photograph, or a diary entry that would lead them to a pasture they hadn't found yet. The way the evidence was stored spoke volumes about the man they had finally captured. This wasn't a disorganized hoard, it was a collection. It was organized with a level of care that indicated a mind that found satisfaction in the details of his own darkness. This was a man who viewed his victims as objects to be filed away, and that realization sent a shiver through the entire investigative team. He had spent his years of freedom not just hiding, but actively curating his obsession. The anger that boiled over in the room was a reaction to the coldness of it all. The fact that he could go to work, pay his bills, and then come home to this meticulously managed nightmare. This was the profile of a man who didn't make mistakes. He was a patient collector of pain. Every file they found was a testament to his belief that he was untouchable. He had lived with this material for decades, confident that no one would ever look behind his unremarkable door. The scope of his depravity was a slap in the face to every person who had ever defended him or called him a quiet neighbor. He had used his technical hobbies and his radio skills to build a wall around his true nature, and the raid was the first time that wall had truly crumbled. The evidence didn't just point to his guilt, it revealed the absolute vacuum of his soul. As they moved through the house, the agents felt the weight of the injustice. This man had been breathing free air for 26 years while Jacob was gone. He had enjoyed the comfort of a home, the taste of food, and the warmth of the sun, all while keeping a digital library of his crimes. The discovery of the cache was a turning point. It stripped away any possibility of a defense. He was a predator, documented and caught. But the victory was tempered by the silence coming from the man himself. He watched them search, his face a mask of indifference, refusing to offer a single word about the night in 1989 that had started it all. As the sun began to set on the day of the raid, Danny Heinrich was led out of his house in handcuffs. It was the image the people of Minnesota had waited nearly 30 years to see, but the mood was far from celebratory. The man was in custody, the evidence of his crimes was being loaded into trucks, but the void remained. The question that had defined a generation was still hanging in the air, heavier than ever. Where is Jacob? The FBI had the man, but they didn't have the boy. They had the perpetrator of the Cold Spring attack, but they didn't have the proof of a murder. The tension between the physical evidence and the missing victim created a high-stakes standoff. Heinrich knew that the child pornography charges alone could keep him in prison for decades, but he also knew that he held the only card that could buy him a shred of mercy. He was a man who understood the value of information. He had lived his life by monitoring signals and staying quiet, and now his silence was his last weapon. The investigators looked at him, a man who looked so ordinary, so tired, so small, and realized that the truth was locked inside a mind that had spent 26 years hardening itself against the world. The mystery box style of the investigation had reached its most critical point. They had unpacked the DNA, they had unpacked the digital collection, and they had finally unpacked the man himself. But the final, most important layer was still sealed shut. Would he break? Would the weight of the evidence finally crush his resolve? Or would he take the secret of the pasture to his grave, leaving the Wetterling family in a permanent state of unknowing? As he was driven away from his house in Annandale, the state of Minnesota held its collective breath. The man was gone, but the ghost of the boy on the gravel road was still waiting to be found. The arrest of Danny Heinrich on federal child pornography charges was a tactical victory, but it created a massive strategic problem for the prosecution. He was sitting in a cell, facing decades behind bars for the digital filth found in his home, but the statute of limitations and a lack of physical evidence meant he couldn't be easily charged with the 1989 kidnapping. The investigators knew they were looking at a man who had likely killed Jacob Wetterling, yet they were legally handcuffed. They had the perpetrator in a cage, but the crime that had haunted a nation for 27 years was still technically a missing persons case. It was a standoff between the desire for total punishment and the desperate, aching need for the truth. The air in the prosecutor's office was thick with a heavy, cold reality. If they went to trial on just the pornography charges, Heinrich might go away for 20 years, but he would take the secret of Jacob's location to his grave. The Wetterling family would be left in a permanent state of suspension, never knowing for sure where their son was or exactly how he had spent his final moments. This is the moment where the legal system stops being about black and white justice and starts being about a brutal, painful trade. The state had to decide if they were willing to let a murderer avoid a murder conviction just to give a mother her son's bones back. It was a calculation of human misery versus legal victory. The proposal that came from Heinrich's defense team was nothing short of a punch to the stomach. He offered a deal that felt like a betrayal of every sense of right and wrong. He would provide a full, detailed confession of the events of October 22, 1989. He would lead the FBI to the exact spot where he had hidden the remains. But in return, he demanded a devil's bargain. He wanted full immunity from any state or federal charges related to the kidnapping and murder of Jacob Wetterling. He would serve 20 years for the pornography, but on the books, he would never be convicted of killing the boy. It was a request for a clean slate on a murder in exchange for the location of a body. Think about the weight of that trade. Some say that a killer should never be allowed to negotiate, that the law should be a hammer that falls regardless of the cost. They argue that by giving him immunity, the state was essentially saying that the truth is more valuable than the punishment. Others believe that the torture of not knowing is a life sentence of its own for the survivors, and that any price is worth paying to end the uncertainty. It is a polarizing, gut-wrenching debate that has no right answer. Some call it a necessary evil, others call it a surrender. What do you think? Should a monster be allowed to trade a confession for his life? Tell me in the comments. Would you sign a deal with a man who stole a child? At the center of this legal storm was Patty Wetterling. For nearly 3 decades, she had been the face of hope, but now she was being asked to make a choice that no human being should ever have to face. She was the one who had to sign off on the deal. She had to decide if she was willing to let her son's killer walk away from a murder charge in order to finally bring him home. The anger and the pain of that choice are almost impossible to calculate. If she said no, she preserved the chance of a murder conviction but guaranteed a lifetime of wondering. If she said yes, she got the answers, but she had to watch the killer win a legal victory. The injustice of this choice is a staggering reminder of the power a predator holds even when he is behind bars. Heinrich was still in control. He was using the remains of an 11-year-old boy as a bargaining chip to save his own skin. The emotional toll on the Wetterling family during these negotiations was a second trauma, a new layer of grief added to a wound that had never closed. Patty looked at the reality of the situation and chose the truth. She chose to prioritize her son over the punishment of his killer. She decided that knowing the end of the story was the only way to truly honor Jacob's memory, even if the legal system had to swallow a bitter, poisonous pill to make it happen. When news of the potential plea deal began to leak, the reaction from the public was a tidal wave of fury. People who had grown up with Jacob's face on posters felt a personal stake in the outcome. There was a sense that the state was setting a dangerous precedent, a get-out-of-murder-free card for the most depraved criminals. The debate spilled out of the courtrooms and into the streets of Minnesota. Critics argued that the justice system was being held hostage by a man who deserved no mercy. They felt that by agreeing to the deal, the authorities were validating Heinrich's methods, proving that if you hide a body well enough for long enough, you can eventually use it to buy your freedom. The controversy was a reflection of our collective desire for a perfect ending, one where the killer is punished to the maximum extent of the law and the family gets closure. But the real world is rarely that clean. The prosecution defended the move, stating that without the deal, the case would likely remain cold forever. They argued that 20 years in a federal prison for a man in his 50s was, in many ways, a life sentence. But the optics were terrible. To many, it looked like a failure of the very laws Patty Wetterling had fought so hard to create. The debate over whether a confession is worth the price of a murder conviction is a question that still divides the community today, a lingering scar on the history of Minnesota justice. In the end, the ink hit the paper. The devil's bargain was signed. The atmosphere in the room when the deal became official wasn't one of triumph. It was a somber, hollow moment. The state had given up its right to prosecute a murder, and Heinrich had given up his secret. It was a transaction of the soul. No one walked away feeling like they had won. The prosecutors felt the weight of the compromise. The investigators felt the sting of the immunity. And the Wetterling family felt the terrifying proximity of the truth they had been seeking for 9,855 days. The silence was finally over, but the words that were about to come would be more painful than the quiet ever was. The deal set the stage for a courtroom confession that would be broadcast to the world. It was the final hurdle before the excavation of the pasture could begin. The tension was at an all-time high, not because of what was unknown, but because of what was about to be revealed. The monster was going to speak. He was going to describe the final hours of a boy who had become a symbol of innocence. The final signature on the plea agreement was the sound of a door opening into a nightmare that had been locked away since 1989. The stage was set for Section 10, the moment Danny Heinrich would sit in a chair and tell the world exactly how he broke a mother's heart. The courtroom was filled with a silence so thick it was difficult to breathe. For 27 years, the people in that room had lived with a ghost, but today the ghost was sitting in a chair, wearing a suit and speaking into a microphone. When Danny Heinrich began to talk, the most striking thing wasn't what he said, but how he said it. His voice was flat, a dry monotone that lacked any trace of remorse or humanity. He spoke about the abduction of an 11-year-old boy as if he were reciting a grocery list or describing a mundane day at the shoe store. This was the man who had held an entire state hostage with his silence, and now that he was finally speaking, he was doing so with a clinical detachment that made the skin crawl. He began at the beginning, on that gravel road in St. Joseph. He described the moment he saw the 3 boys on their bikes, his choice to step out of the dark with his weapon drawn, and the terrifying commands he gave. He admitted to telling Trevor and Aaron to run into the woods, a detail that had haunted those boys for their entire adult lives. In the courtroom, the Wetterling family sat just feet away, forced to listen as the monster recounted the exact moment their lives were shattered. He didn't look at them. He kept his eyes fixed forward, a man who had finally decided to trade his secrets for his safety. He confirmed that he had chosen Jacob at random, a terrifying admission that proved there was no reason, no logic, and no escape from the shadow that had fallen over that road. As the confession continued, Heinrich described the minutes following the abduction. He spoke about forcing Jacob into the car, a vehicle that had become a rolling cage of terror. He detailed the drive away from the scene, navigating the backroads he knew so well. He talked about Jacob's reaction, the questions the boy asked, the fear in his voice, and the heartbreaking realization that the child was still trying to find a way to survive. The narrator of this horror story didn't flinch as he described the path they took, leading further and further away from the safety of the Wetterling home and deeper into the darkness of the Minnesota countryside. He drove toward Painesville, toward a piece of land he had scouted before. He was a man with a map in his head, a man who knew exactly where the world stopped watching. Inside the car, the boy in the red jacket was realizing that the man with the raspy voice wasn't going to let him go. Heinrich recounted the turns he made, the gravel crunching under the tires, and the way the lights of the town faded into the distance. The tension in the courtroom reached a breaking point as he described pulling off the road and into a secluded pasture. The world was about to learn what happened in those final moments, but as Heinrich paused to take a sip of water, the silence returned, heavier than before. He had reached the edge of the field and the end was coming. The details of what happened in that pasture are a testament to the absolute depravity of a man who viewed a child as nothing more than a thing to be used and discarded. Heinrich described the assault with the same terrifying lack of emotion, a narrative of violence that left the room in a state of shock. He then spoke about the moment the weapon was fired. He didn't describe it as a tragedy. He described it as a necessity, a way to ensure his own silence. The boy who had been a symbol of hope for a generation was gone in a single, cold-blooded instant. The weapon that had been used to threaten him on the road had fulfilled its dark purpose in the tall grass of a lonely field. The immediate aftermath was a scene of clinical efficiency. Heinrich didn't panic. He didn't flee in a state of regret. He stood in the dark, surrounded by the silence of the pasture, and began to plan his next move. He had just committed the most infamous crime in the history of the state, and his first thought was how to hide the evidence. The anger that vibrated through the courtroom was a physical force as he recounted the coldness of his heart in that moment. He had a shovel in the car. He had a plan. He began to dig, turning the soil of a stranger's land into a secret that he intended to keep forever. The act of violence was over, but the act of concealment was just beginning. Heinrich spent the early hours of October 23, 1989, turning a pasture into a grave. He described the physical labor of the burial, the way he covered his tracks, and the careful manner in which he ensured nothing was left behind. When he was finished, he simply drove home. He didn't throw away his clothes or wash the car in a panic. He went asleep. The next morning, as the sirens began to wail across the county and the first search parties were being organized, Danny Heinrich was waking up in his own bed, a man who had successfully transitioned back into his ordinary life. He went to work. He spoke to people. He lived his day as if nothing had happened. This is perhaps the most shocking part of the confession, the ease with which he carried the weight of a murder. He watched the news reports. He saw the face of the boy he had just buried appearing on every television screen in the country. He saw the posters being taped to the windows of the stores where he shopped. Most people would have crumbled under that level of scrutiny, but Heinrich found a way to use it. He used the information to stay ahead of the investigators, monitoring the search areas and the theories of the police. He was the only person in the world who knew where the search should actually be happening, and he sat in his home, silent and satisfied, while the state of Minnesota wept. A year later, the monster returned to the scene of the crime. Heinrich revealed that he hadn't been content to let the remains stay in their original location. He had become paranoid about the development of the land or the possibility of a farmer stumbling across the site. In a move that defines the depth of his cruelty, he returned to the pasture under the cover of darkness to dig up the remains and move them. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to maintain his control over the secret, even as the anniversary of the abduction was bringing a new wave of attention to the case. He reburied the remains in a more secure spot, a small, unremarkable patch of earth that he would monitor for the next quarter century. He lived with that knowledge for 27 years. He drove past the area. He knew the exact coordinates of the tragedy while the rest of the world was looking for a white van or a stranger from another state. The confession ended with the location, the specific spot in a field where the search should have ended decades ago. The secret of the soil was finally out. The courtroom sat in a state of collective trauma. Finally knowing the truth but destroyed by the weight of it. The man in the suit was done talking. He had bought his safety with his story, leaving the world to pick up the pieces of a nightmare that was finally, horrifyingly, over. The physical recovery was all that remained. The coordinates led them to a patch of land that looked like 1,000 other fields in central Minnesota. It was early September, a time when the air begins to sharpen, and the goldenrod stands tall in the ditches. The scene was deceptively peaceful, a quiet pasture where the only sound should have been the wind through the grass. But the arrival of the white forensic tents and the line of investigators in blue jackets turned the field into a site of profound, somber gravity. They didn't use backhoes or heavy machinery at first. This wasn't a construction site. It was a sanctuary of secrets. They moved with hand trowels and brushes, sifting through the dirt as if they were handling ancient, fragile glass. The grid was laid out with mathematical precision. Every square inch of soil was accounted for, a slow and methodical dance with the past. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a crime scene when the search is no longer a theory. The investigators worked in a state of focused reverence, knowing that the earth beneath their boots held the answer to a question that had defined their careers and their community. The sun beat down on the plastic tarps, creating a hothouse atmosphere where the smell of damp earth and old roots filled the air. This was the work of undoing 27 years of concealment, one layer of silt at a time. As they dug deeper, the transition from the topsoil to the darker, more compacted earth signaled that they were nearing the level where the secret had been hidden. The packing of the work slowed even further. Every pebble, every root, and every clump of clay was inspected. They were looking for something that didn't belong to the natural world, a fragment of a life that had been interrupted. The tension in the field was a physical weight, a pressure in the chest that made every breath feel labored. They were returning to the earth to reclaim what the monster had tried to erase, and the proximity of the truth was beginning to vibrate through the very tools in their hands. Then the rhythm of the dig stopped. A brush moved across a pocket of dark soil, and instead of brown or gray, a shock of color emerged. It was a flash of red, vibrant, synthetic, and unmistakable. In an instant, the clinical atmosphere of the excavation was shattered by a surge of raw, human realization. This wasn't just a piece of debris. It was a fragment of nylon, the exact shade of the jacket that had been burned into the collective memory of an entire nation. The red hockey jacket was no longer a symbol on a missing person poster. It was a physical reality emerging from the grave. The shift in energy was violent. a sudden acceleration of the heart that made the quiet of the field feel like a roar. The fabric was tangled with the earth, held tight by the roots that had grown through it over nearly 3 decades. As the investigators worked to clear the perimeter, the shape of the garment began to take form. It was a small jacket, designed for an 11-year-old boy who was supposed to have a whole life ahead of him. Seeing that red nylon against the cold, dark dirt was a pattern interrupt of the most devastating kind. It bridged the gap between 1989 and the present in a single heartbeat. The jacket had survived the snows of 27 winters and the heat of 27 summers, waiting in the dark to tell its story. The discovery changed everything. The what-if was gone. The hope that had been a flickering candle for so long was finally, mercifully, and tragically extinguished. There was no more room for denial or theories about runaways or sightings in other states. The red jacket was the definitive proof that the pasture was a place of ending. The investigators stood back for a moment, the weight of the find pressing down on their shoulders. They had found the boy. Or rather, they had found what remained of the boy who had once worn that jacket with pride. The field of bone and red nylon was finally surrendering its truth, and the world would never be the same. With the jacket as a guide, the forensic recovery transitioned into its most delicate phase. The science of sorrow is a meticulous process where every fragment of bone and every personal effect is treated with the highest level of care. The remains were not just evidence, they were a person. The team worked with a level of concentration that excluded the rest of the world, focusing entirely on the small, fragile markers of Jacob's presence. They found the small things, the artifacts of a childhood interrupted. A buckle, a scrap of clothing, the tiny physical remnants that had stayed with him in the dark for 10,000 days. The forensic anthropologists documented the position of every find, recreating the final moments through the language of the soil. There was an absolute, ringing silence across the pasture as the truth was catalogued. No one spoke unless it was necessary. The gravity of the task was a silent bond between the investigators, a shared understanding that they were the last people to walk this path with Jacob. They were the ones who would carry him out of the field. The precision of the work was a form of respect, a way to restore a tiny bit of dignity to a life that had been treated with such profound cruelty by the man who put him there. Every piece of evidence was placed in a sterile container, a sharp contrast to the messy, organic reality of the grave. The red nylon was carefully preserved, its color still a haunting reminder of the boy who had been stolen. The soil was sifted through fine mesh screens, ensuring that not even the smallest fragment was left behind. By the time the sun began to set, the pasture had been stripped of its secret. The science was complete, but the emotional impact was just beginning to settle into the bones of everyone present. They had a catalog of remains and a box of artifacts, but more importantly, they had the truth. The confirmation didn't take long. The forensic match was definitive, a biological certainty that closed the book on the search. When the word found was finally spoken by the authorities, it carried a weight that shook the state of Minnesota to its core. For 27 years, the word missing had been a jagged, open-ended question. Found was a period at the end of a long, agonizing sentence. It was the moment the posters could finally come down, not because the boy was home, but because the mystery was over. The search had ended in a field of bone and red nylon, miles away from the home where a light had been kept on for 3 decades. The transition from a missing person case to a recovery is a crushing form of finality. It is the death of the maybe. The Wetterling family was finally given the one thing they had been fighting for, the truth. But the truth was a heavy, cold thing to hold. They finally knew where he was, but the where was a pasture, and the how was a nightmare. The official confirmation was the signal for a nation to grieve one last time for the boy in the red jacket. The case was no longer a mystery box. It was a tragedy with a known ending. The searchers could go home. The psychics could stop calling. The files could be closed. Bringing Jacob home in this way was the ultimate injustice, Yet it was the only piece available. The field near Painesville would forever be marked by what had happened there, a scar on the geography of the heartland. As the white tents were taken down and the investigators drove away for the last time, the pasture returned to its quiet state. But the earth was lighter now. The secret had been lifted. The long-awaited homecoming was finally happening, not with a bicycle ride up a driveway, but with a forensic van and a small box. The search was over, and the era of Jacob Wetterling had reached its final, heartbreaking conclusion. The final day in court was not about the evidence, the DNA, or the maps. It was about the reckoning. Danny Heinrich sat at the defense table, no longer the mysterious ghost of a cold case, but a convicted man whose secrets had been stripped away. The air in the room was heavy with a 27-year-old exhaustion that was finally finding its end. The judge's voice was steady as the details of the 20-year sentence were read, a sentence that many in the public felt was far too light for a man who had confessed to stealing a life. But in that courtroom, the focus shifted away from the length of the prison term and toward the people who had survived the long wait. The power dynamic had flipped. The man in the suit was small and defeated, while the family he had tried to break stood tall. The legal finality of the moment provided a closure that was as cold as it was necessary. There would be no more appeals, no more what-ifs, and no more bargaining. The deal was done. The silence that Heinrich had used as a weapon for decades was now his own prison. As he was led away for the last time, the click of the handcuffs was the final punctuation mark on a story that had begun on a gravel road in 1989. The courtroom began to empty, but the weight of the moment remained. It was a victory of the truth over a lie, a reminder that while justice can be delayed by a generation, it cannot be avoided forever. The man who lived in the shadows was being sent to a place where the lights never go out, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, the people of Minnesota could look toward a future that wasn't haunted by his anonymity. When Patty Wetterling stood to deliver her impact statement, the room seemed to shrink around her. She didn't speak with a voice of hatred or a desire for vengeance. She spoke with the authority of a woman who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and refused to stay there. She looked toward the man who had taken her son and told him, in no uncertain terms, that he had failed. He had taken Jacob's body, but he hadn't taken the light Jacob brought into the world. He had tried to bury a secret, but instead, he had planted a movement. Her resilience was a shield against the darkness he represented. She refused to let his name be the last word in her son's story. She spoke of the 11 years of joy Jacob had given them, choosing to focus on the life rather than the ending. It was a masterclass in human strength. She told the world that her heart was broken, but her spirit was intact. This is the ultimate life lesson from the Wetterling case, that even when the worst happens, we have a choice in how we respond. We can let the tragedy consume us, or we can use the heat of that fire to forge something that protects others. Patty chose the latter. She looked into the face of a monster and chose to remain a person of hope. Her words weren't just for the court. They were for every parent who has ever felt the grip of fear. She proved that the light doesn't just survive. It wins by refusing to go out. The transition from a national mystery to a private funeral was a somber homecoming. For 27 years, Jacob Wetterling belonged to the public. He was the boy on the poster, the reason for the laws, and the face of every parent's nightmare. But when the remains were finally recovered from that pasture, he became a son again. The private service was a moment for the family to reclaim their boy from the headlines and the evidence lockers. The public mourning across the state was a sea of blue and red, a collective exhale from a community that had carried this burden for 3 decades. The discovery changed everything. The word missing was finally erased, replaced by the crushing but healing finality of a grave. The funeral wasn't just a goodbye, it was a promise kept. The Wetterlings had promised they would find him, and they did. They had promised he wouldn't be forgotten, and he wasn't. The images of the red hockey jacket being laid to rest were a visual reminder that the story had come full circle. The grief was still there, sharp and jagged, but it was no longer fueled by the unknown. There is a peace that comes with the truth, however brutal that truth may be. As the family stood by the site, the nation watched with a sense of shared sorrow. We had all waited for him to come home, and though the homecoming wasn't what we prayed for, it was the only ending that could truly bring the state of Minnesota back to a sense of balance. The legacy of Jacob Wetterling is not found in the field where he was hidden, but in the millions of children who are safer because of his name. The laws that bear his signature remain a permanent fixture of the American legal system, a lasting defense against the kind of darkness that took him. But the true legacy is the lesson of the light. We learned that a community can be held together by hope, and that a single family's determination can change the world. The case of the boy from St. Joseph is a reminder that we must never stop looking, never stop caring, and never stop demanding the truth. The light Jacob brought remains a guide for those still searching for their own lost ones. This story ends here, but the work for justice never truly stops. There are others still waiting for their red nylon moment, other families living in the silence that the Wetterlings finally broke. Don't let the lessons of this case be left behind in the archives of history. Carry the vigilance and the compassion forward into your own communities. When you see a missing person poster, remember that there is a name, a life, and a family behind it that deserves an answer. The search for Jacob is over, but the search for a safer world continues every day. Thank you for walking this long road through the dark and into the light. The story of Jacob Wetterling is finished, but his light is everywhere, reminding us to always keep the porch light on.